Got to get through the boring stuff first, the figures. Growth down, probably as expected, but are those figures now realistic? 1.8% next year, 0.6% this year, for instance?
Well, of course, you know, it's been a characteristic of this particular downturn that every year the Chancellor gets up, he has to shift back the point at which, or shift forward the point at which the economy returns to normal, and he's done that again. So whether you think this is credible or not is your own judgment, really. We're still talking about the same sort of time frame for the economy to get back to normal. It's always 2 or 3 years out in the future, and every year it gets further shunted into the future.
Any political damage from that, or I guess half expected, really?
Well, the growth figures, and particularly the figures for the deficit, are fairly terrible. The fact that we will still have a deficit in 2017-2018, which is halfway through the next Parliament, is hugely depressing in itself. The Chancellor was unable to say when the deficit might be eliminated altogether. It's almost as if he doesn't even want to suggest that it might ever be eliminated. We might be stuck with a permanent deficit at this rate. So the numbers on the economy are fairly terrible. I thought the politics of it were quite intelligent from George Osborne's point of view. We discussed earlier what he had to do to impress his own side, certainly, and he came up with a number of measures which certainly appeared to delight Conservative MPs because they were quite populist measures on petrol, on mortgage, on tax, which MPs will be able to take back to their constituencies this weekend and say, see, Conservative-led government is giving you a cut in beer duty, and it's helping you on tax, and it's helping you on your fuel costs. And that is something that Tory MPs will be very happy about.
And business owners, at least, not too unhappy, especially the SMEs, the small to medium businesses. There's this almost, well, national insurance, I suppose, holiday, as it were.
Yeah, no, that's a big, important initiative and pretty good news, I think, and the right sort of thing to be doing. You know, the majority of businesses in Britain are small enterprises. One man and his dog, 2-3 people, and many of those will be taken out of paying national insurance altogether. So that's obviously good news. Now, sorry to use the old cliche, but the devil is always in the detail, and you have to look. Wait, when you've got the budget document, there's a page in there which is always the most instructive page in the whole document, which is where the money is coming from and where it's going. Until you actually see that, it's hard to know precisely whether this is, you know, on balance, a good budget. But on the face of it, you know, there were some quite significant initiatives. There was national insurance. There were a whole package of measures to boost the housing market, some of which I thought were quite good. They're more than just tinkering. They should indeed turbocharge things quite substantially, I would think.
Jeremy is absolutely right about wanting to check the figures, because of course what George Osborne has done is he has found those various billions we talked about to give away. So the starting point for tax is going to go up to £10,000 next year, a year early. He's going to need some money to do that. He's going to need money in order to give people a cut in the beer duty. He's going to need money in order to pay for foregoing revenue from fuel duty. He's going to need money in order to give business this cut in corporation tax that he's offered. All those things add up, and the question is, where is the money coming from to pay for all that? And I suspect that even now people are poring over those figures to work out where he's doing it. And what is interesting about this Chancellor, and has been about this government, and the point he made, that these days, under this government, the rich are paying far more tax than they paid at any point during the 13 years of Labour. One of the striking things about this Conservative Chancellor is that he has been quite redistributive. The tax burden has shifted significantly away from those at the bottom end and towards those at the top end, and in particular to those in the middle, who are being more and more dragged into the 40p rate of tax.
Do you think that's sort of a Lib Dem influence? And also, how does that play with the electorate, and particularly Tory voters?
Well, it's a very good question. For Tories looking at this budget, they will say, well, George Osborne seems to be doing a lot of things that are popular with the Lib Dems. In particular, it is the Lib Dem policy, something that they have advanced for a long time, to get the tax threshold up to £10,000. And the Lib Dems say that they are the ones who are getting the credit for that measure on the doorstep, and not the Conservatives. So George Osborne is announcing a big Lib Dem measure. What does he get out of it? Question mark.
Yeah, and another point worth making about, you know, bring forward the by a year the date when we meet that target of 10,000, is that is substantially paid for effectively by the sort of fiscal drag of bringing more and more people into the 40% tax band. And, you know, in terms of core Tory support, that's not a good position to be in.
Another measure which I guess we guessed at was highly leaked, if we're being honest here, is infrastructure spending. Up to £3 billion. We maybe thought it might be 2.5 billion, but that's starting, I think, if I'm right, in 2015. Is it too little, too late, or is it a welcome measure?
I mean, anything extra on infrastructure spending, I think, is welcome. As the Chancellor said, he inherited the plan from Labour. That's one thing. That's one of the many things he can blame Labour for. They've already moved a little way in trying to reverse that. But the point is, he announced. You know, it's all in the way you phrase these things. So it's an extra $3 billion a year for infrastructure spending, but it's only $3 billion relative to where it was going to be. So it's still down, and that's the more significant way of looking at it.
Infrastructure spending is one of these things that is terribly worthy, incredibly useful, and probably good for the economy, but it does very little in terms of changing the economic situation now. And I think there's nothing that we can say that would suggest that George Osborne will derive any political benefit, certainly in time for the 2015 election, for infrastructure projects which aren't even in the ground yet and may take years to come on stream.
One point is worth looking for in the budget documentation in terms of where the money is coming from is the Chancellor said, for instance, that he was going to fund the national insurance cut from money he was going to get from the pension reforms. Well, there's been a lot of debate about how much money he is actually going to be able to claim from the pension reforms, because the substantial gain is actually from the public sector. It's merely the public sector paying itself. So whether you should count that in the numbers or not is an interesting debating point. So I'd be particularly interested when those figures come in to see how much he is trying to claim that he'll gain from those pension reforms. It could be as high as $6 billion. My suspicion is that the OBR will allow no more than $2 to $3 billion.
And I guess, in a way, though, knowing those figures will also depend on growth going forward, which is a bit of an unknown. I mean, you talked about some green shoots of recovery, but they're still rather green at the moment, if we're being honest.
The fact is that there's things going on out there that suggest that the economy is beginning to turn around, but as George Osborne made a point of developing at length in his budget speech, he is incredibly vulnerable, and Britain is incredibly vulnerable to what's going on in the Eurozone. That is the big caveat that he has placed over the economy and over what he is trying to do. I think the verdict will be that he has done a number of useful things in his budget, some of them quite audacious. They certainly appear to be designed to stimulate the economy. The stuff on mortgage and housing is going to have quite an effect on the housing market, one suspects. There's also been this big change in the way the Bank of England is allowed to interpret its remit on inflation. It's incredibly complicated and the detail needs to be studied, but it suggests that the bank will have a lot more flexibility, and that in turn may have a beneficial effect on the economy, but that remains to be seen. For George Osborne, from the point of view of the politics, his biggest challenge was to not produce the kind of disaster he produced last year, where he produced a disaster that started falling apart politically. It's too early to tell. We've only just heard his speech, but the impression this time is that he's been much more careful about how he's structured it, and he's done things that are designed to please his own backbenchers. And for the time being, I think the verdict must be broadly positive.